She was born Princess Abe in the year 661 into the bloodlines that had long defined the Yamato court. Her father was Emperor Tenji, a reformer of the court bureaucracy. Her mother was from the Soga clan, long resented and feared for its tight grip on court affairs. She was sister to princes who would become emperors, niece to others who had ruled before, and from birth she was positioned within the careful structure of succession that surrounded the Japanese imperial house. But within that structure, there had never been space for her to rise alone. Her duty was not to rule. It was to be ruled beside and to bear sons who might rule after. That was how her marriage to Prince Kusakabe, himself the son of the formidable Empress Jito, had been shaped. Their union was not romantic or accidental. It was designed to stabilize two branches of the same imperial tree, and it succeeded in producing the child who mattered most, Prince Obito, later known as Shomu. But power moved faster than the child could grow. Prince Kusakabe died young, and the succession lost its footing. The court was forced to watch as their carefully ordered future began to unravel. By 697, Empress Jito had stepped down in favor of her grandson Monmu, a calculated transition that appeared stable on the surface. Monmu's rule, however, would last only a few years. His death in 707, likely from illness, brought forward an uncomfortable truth. The heir, Prince Obito, was still a child. Too young to rule, too young even to pretend, and too valuable to be handed over carelessly. The question was not whether someone would rule in his place. The question was, who could do so without disrupting the delicate balance of competing families, ministers, and spiritual advisors that surrounded the throne? That question brought eyes back to Princess Abe, by then the mother of the heir and the widow of the crown's future. Her elevation to the throne was not framed as ambition. It was necessity. She was chosen not because she was powerful, but because her presence could preserve the image of unity, at least for a while. The court called her Genmei, adopting the name that would mark her era. But it was not yet clear what that name would mean. At first, there was caution. Genmei's reign began as a protective shell around the prince. She was expected to hold the throne lightly, to act as regent in all but name. Male courtiers, ministers, and extended relatives continued to shape policy in her early months. Many saw her presence as temporary, a quiet interval before real governance resumed. But what followed was not silence. Over the next months, Genmei began to assert decisions in her own right. She oversaw changes to provincial governance, began expanding the palace bureaucracy, and set in motion new building projects that signaled more than maintenance. They signaled intent. She did not speak often in court, but she did not need to. Her power rested in restraint. By holding the throne not as a bridge but as a seat, she changed its shape, and the court noticed. The court had miscalculated. They had assumed that a woman of her age and status would govern as a mother, concerned with lineage, concerned with preservation. But Genmei governed like a sovereign. She used her position to delay the prince's rise, not accelerate it. She placed allies in administrative posts previously dominated by older male aristocrats. She shifted the rhythms of succession away from the urgency of male majority and toward the logic of continuity. In doing so, she gave herself time, not just to hold power, but to redefine it. While outwardly, the capital remained stable, internally, it became clear that Genmei's presence was not merely transitional, it was structural. What had begun as a compromise now revealed itself as a transformation. Genmei was not the first woman to rule in Japan, but she was the first to do so with a living male heir standing in the wings. That alone changed the stakes. The court could not dismiss her rule as a placeholder, nor could they reverse it without disturbing the very stability they had hoped to preserve. Genmei understood this. She did not rush toward reform. She did not rely on charisma or spectacle. Her strength came from understanding the quiet power of impermanence, the way that holding the throne slowly could make it hers entirely. And as the court adjusted to her rhythm, she began to plan what would follow. From the earliest days of her reign, Empress Genmei was measured not only by her actions, but by what she refused to become. The court that surrounded her, steeped in generations of patriarchal hierarchy, assumed that a woman elevated by necessity would rule through deferral. She was expected to govern as a mother, not as a monarch, and the moment her son was ready to take the throne, they expected her to step aside without resistance. This belief shaped the way court factions approached her. The Fujiwara clan, in particular, positioned themselves to dominate her rule through suggestion, flattery, and quiet assumption. They filled offices around her with men loyal to their house. They sent scribes, messengers, and advisors to shape her daily decisions. They spoke of harmony and legacy, but behind each word was a quiet presumption that Genmei would govern like a shadow, not a center of power. She listened, but she did not follow. Instead of surrounding herself with Fujiwara partisans, Genmei drew close to loyalists of her late husband, Emperor Monmu, many of whom owed their positions not to the great houses, but to direct appointment or personal loyalty. These men, often overlooked by more ambitious aristocrats, served as quiet buffers between the empress and the factions that sought to guide her hand. She placed them in provincial posts, in court bureaus, and in roles of ritual authority. In doing so, she slowed the momentum of the more aggressive houses. Her decisions came slowly, often without comment, but they came with precision, and each one carved a clearer space for her autonomy. She also made use of the one political tool no court faction could ignore, Prince Obito himself. Though still a child, the prince represented the future of the dynasty. He was the bridge between rival lineages and the symbol of imperial continuity. Rather than preparing him publicly for a swift rise, Genmei kept him deliberately close and conspicuously quiet. She made no immediate moves to name him crown prince or to announce a timeline for abdication. This ambiguity unsettled the court. Without knowing when the transition would come, they could not plan. The Fujiwara, hoping to become the prince's political caretakers, were left waiting for a moment that did not arrive. And in that waiting, Genmei redefined the rules. Unlike her female predecessors, Genmei ruled with an heir standing in the wings. This created tension not only in politics but in perception. If she acted too decisively, she risked being seen as obstructing the boy's rise. If she acted too passively, she invited control. Navigating this narrow space required more than caution. It required subtle forms of strength, restraint, ambiguity, and the slow accumulation of authority through action, rather than declaration. Genmei mastered that space. She did not speak often in open court, but her directives carried weight. She did not argue. She outlasted. Over time, the tone of the court shifted. What began as condescension turned into caution. Ministers learned to wait for her final word before assuming policy was set. Bureaucrats understood that appointments could be reversed quietly, without explanation. Messages from the provinces began to reflect a new rhythm of governance, one in which the sovereign's decisions did not always follow precedent. These changes did not come with proclamations or grand reforms. They came through method, through personnel, and through the tightening of imperial rituals that centered the empress not as a figurehead, but as the living source of order. Still, Genmei was careful never to provoke open confrontation. She allowed factions to believe they still had influence. She tolerated gestures of loyalty from houses she privately distrusted. She did not attempt to purge rivals or break long-standing alliances, but she also did not allow any single group to dictate the future. Her governance was not a rejection of court tradition. It was a redirection of its flow, subtle, deliberate, and difficult to undo. The crown had never been made for her, but she wore it without apology, not as a stopgap, not as a steward. She ruled in her own right, holding both the past and the future in balance. And as Prince Obito watched from within the palace walls, he saw a model of rule that was neither weak nor loud. A mother, yes, but also an empress whose authority did not wait to be granted. The structures of Japanese succession in the early 8th century were shaped less by law than by perception, by bloodline, ritual legitimacy, and the silent tug-of-war between clans and temples. Prince Kusakabe's death in 689 had already reshaped the court. As the designated heir and son of Empress Jito, his passing created uncertainty that no proclamation could easily resolve. His son, Prince Obito, was still a child, and the imperial line, though thick with names, was thin on unifying figures. The throne passed to Emperor Monmu, Obito's cousin, and when Monmu too died young in 707, the court faced the same dilemma again. Who would lead while Obito remained too young to govern? Genmei, as the boy's mother and widow of the fallen heir, was placed on the throne. But her position, while officially sanctioned, was surrounded by shadows that refused to settle. Within this atmosphere of careful watching and veiled tension, another death altered the balance. Prince Takechi, a powerful figure with military credentials and direct descent from Emperor Tenmu, had long held the loyalty of court officials who mistrusted the influence of the Fujiwara and resented the growing power of Genmei's household. He had been a central player during Empress Jito's reign and was seen as a viable successor in earlier succession crises. Even after being passed over, his presence served as a reminder of alternative possibilities. He was older, experienced, and his name was respected in the provinces. His unexpected death, not long after Genmei's accession, changed more than court arithmetic. It collapsed one of the last viable threats to her son's eventual succession. The cause of Prince Takechi's death was officially illness. But illness, in the courts of early Japan, carried layered meaning. Poison was not uncommon. Spiritual attacks were believed possible. Sudden decline was accepted without challenge only when the political winds were quiet. In this case, they were not. While no record directly implicates Genmei, her silence in the aftermath was noticeable. She made no public gestures of mourning beyond ritual minimums. No honors were extended beyond expectation. No proclamations acknowledged his passing as a moment of national loss. In a court where symbolism carried as much weight as decree. Her restraint signaled something cold, something calculated. Other deaths followed. Princes distantly related but still holding imperial blood saw their influence curtailed or their positions reduced. Some were reassigned to provincial duties far from the capital. Others simply faded from record. There were no purges, no trials, no executions. But the thinning of rivals was evident. By the time Prince Obito was formally designated as Crown Prince in 714, the field was clear in a way it had not been for decades. His path to the throne no longer required justification. It had become inevitable. Within the cloisters and monastic compounds, the developments were not missed. Buddhist monks, who operated both within and outside the court sphere, had long played a role in interpreting the spiritual balance of the state. They observed omens, recorded natural disasters, and offered ritual purification in times of transition. Some viewed the string of deaths as karmic correction, evidence that Genmei's bloodline, tied to Emperor Tenji, was reclaiming dominance over Emperor Tenmu's. Others were less certain. Whispers of imbalance circulated in the temples near Nara. Stories of untimely death found their way into temple records under ambiguous phrasing. The monk Gyoki, still a rising figure at the time, began preaching more openly on the importance of moral governance, careful words, but delivered at a time when many were wondering what justice meant in the capital. Yet Genmei made no defensive move. She neither explained nor denied. Her strength came from an absence of reaction. She continued reforms, continued building the foundations of bureaucratic administration, and continued to shield her son from the spotlight. Where her predecessors had ruled through declaration, she ruled through stillness. The deaths around her did not ignite scandal. They quieted it, and in that quiet, her power deepened, not through conquest or celebration, but through the disappearance of alternatives. In 710, Empress Genmei made a decision that would reorder the physical and political geography of Japan. With a single imperial edict, she moved the capital from Fujiwara-kyo to a newly planned city, Heijō-kyō. It was not a relocation driven by disaster or decay. Fujiwara had been functioning, its palaces intact, its rituals regular. But Genmei's choice was not about convenience. It was about control. The relocation marked a break, not just from location, but from lineage. Fujiwara-kyo had been established under the influence of Empress Jito and the Tenmu line. Its buildings, placements, and administrative routes favored certain families, reinforced familiar hierarchies, and spatially preserved the memory of the previous generation. Genmei's new city would erase that foundation and start over, measured, ordered, and unclaimed. Heijō-kyō was planned deliberately, with its structure inspired by Chang'an, the capital of China's Tang dynasty. The rectangular layout followed Chinese models of urban authority: broad avenues, rigid grids, centralized administrative quarters, and zones demarcated for religious, commercial, and residential functions. This was not a return to native custom. It was an embrace of continental models that symbolized not only power, but modernity. In choosing this form, Genmei aligned herself with one of the most dominant civilizations of the age. It was a message to both her subjects and her rivals. Japan's imperial future would not evolve organically. It would be built, square by square, gate by gate, according to the shape she chose. The construction of Heijō-kyō disrupted more than daily life. It disrupted the flow of influence. Court families with ancestral estates near Fujiwara found their physical proximity to power undone. Bureaucratic routines had to be recalibrated. Religious institutions, once rooted near the old capital, had to decide whether to follow the court or remain behind. The Fujiwara clan, for whom Fujiwara-kyo had been a namesake and stronghold, found themselves repositioned both literally and politically. No longer at the court's center, they were forced to renegotiate their status within the new order. Genmei did not issue warnings or apologies. She simply moved the throne. The move also had administrative consequences. With the new city came new records, new census counts, and new land allocations. Bureaucratic systems were rewritten to suit the city's layout. Registrars and ministers found their roles reshaped by the geography itself. Centralization no longer meant gathering in an inherited palace. It meant navigating a government designed from the ground up to reinforce imperial primacy. The emperor's residence stood at the northern end of the city, elevated both in terrain and symbolism. From there, roads ran straight and wide, lines of access, but also lines of control. Religious institutions were not excluded, but they were restructured. Temples were assigned formal zones within the capital plan, integrated but contained. Their placement echoed Buddhist cosmology, but also clarified jurisdiction. While Buddhism remained central to court identity, it now did so within boundaries that Genmei's government had drawn. The line between sacred and secular narrowed, but it did not blur. The state retained its frame, and within that frame, the empress remained its axis. Genmei's decision to found Heijō-kyō was more than architectural. It was a sovereign act of redefinition. By building a new capital, she did what few rulers ever attempt. She made the court itself portable, contingent, and subject to will. The city would remain Japan's capital for most of the 8th century. Its walls would house the early flowering of classical Japanese governance, literature, and religious synthesis. But it began not with a vision of culture or reform. It began with a political maneuver, quiet, sweeping, irreversible, and in its measured symmetry, it bore the signature of the woman who had ordered it. By the middle of Genmei's reign, stability was not guaranteed by silence alone. Beneath the formal rhythms of ritual and bureaucracy, discontent stirred in the provinces. Far from Heijō-kyō, in the administrative outpost of Dazaifu on Kyushu, unrest began to take shape, not in open confrontation, but in the slow, corrosive spread of rumor, forgery, and doubt. The figure at the center of this disruption was Muto no Wakako, a low-ranking official who claimed imperial descent and began circulating documents, asserting his authority to govern in the name of the empress. These documents bore imperial phrases, stylized commands, and most notably, seals that appeared official. In an era when governance depended on the written word and the court's reach was stretched thin, the impact was immediate and unsettling. Orders could no longer be trusted without suspicion. What arrived in provincial offices might be a decree or a forgery carrying someone else's agenda. The rebellion itself was small, contained within a few districts, and quickly suppressed. But the damage was not measured in soldiers or battles. It was measured in doubt. The appearance of imperial seals on counterfeit scrolls shattered the sense of order Genmei had worked to build through structure and control. In the early Nara period, the authority of the emperor rested as much on symbolism as on force. If that symbolism could be copied, misused, or repurposed by provincial actors, then the lines of power were not as secure as they seemed. Worse still was the rumor that traveled alongside the rebellion, that the Empress herself had authorized the documents in secret, that she was testing her reach, undermining her ministers, or preparing for a shadow shift in authority. The accusation held no evidence, but it spread. Genmei responded without spectacle. The rebellion was put down swiftly, its participants detained, its leaders executed or silenced through exile. There were no dramatic proclamations, no trials in the capital, no public displays of punishment. Instead, the court issued statements reaffirming the sacred inviolability of imperial seals, and procedures were tightened across all ministries. Access to official seals and clerical materials was restricted. Regional governors were reminded of the punishments for accepting documents not explicitly verified. These measures addressed the forgery, but not the fear. In Heijō-kyō, ministers debated how such counterfeits had been possible at all. Some suggested clerks in the capital had cooperated. Others pointed to Buddhist scribes with access to ceremonial tools. The court grew wary, not only of the provinces, but of itself. The Empress said little. She did not defend herself against the rumor. She did not explain how the seals had come into circulation. She did not assign blame to any internal rival. Her silence allowed the court to spin its own theories, each one deepening the uncertainty. But through that uncertainty, her authority only hardened. In a political environment where no one could be sure who had acted or why, she remained the only constant, untouched, unquestioned. The confusion became its own kind of control. This moment marked a turning point in Genmei's reign, not because it threatened her position, but because it revealed how fragile the illusion of order had become. The tools of imperial rule, seals, scrolls, decrees, had become vulnerable. And Genmei's response was not to restore faith in the old tools, but to tighten their secrecy. She did not reassure. She withdrew. And in that distance, the image of the Empress became more formidable. Not because she ruled with fear, but because no one could quite explain how she ruled at all. As Prince Obito neared adolescence, the question of his future no longer rested on bloodline alone. The court watched his development carefully, his education, his behavior, and most of all, his influences. Among them, one figure began to draw particular attention: Gyoki, a Buddhist monk whose sermons had begun to reach far beyond temple walls. He was unlike the ritual priests long embedded in court life. Gyoki spoke in vernacular, not in sutras. He traveled on foot, not by procession. And he addressed commoners directly, often outside of sanctioned structures. To the court, this was deviation. To the public, it was vision. Under Genmei's reign, Gyoki's reputation grew, not by decree, but by proximity. It was said he offered teachings not only to laborers and farmers, but to members of the royal household. Prince Obito listened. And in listening, he changed the expectations around him. Gyoki's rise came at a moment when the spiritual and political boundaries of the state were being renegotiated. Buddhism, formally accepted at court for over a century, had largely been controlled, channeled through approved temples, linked to specific rituals of state protection. and kept close to official power. But Gyoki practiced a more itinerant form. His teachings emphasized karmic responsibility and social duty. He organized irrigation projects and burial grounds. He blurred the line between monk and administrator, and because he did so beyond court appointment, he unnerved those who had long used religion as a supplement to imperial order. Genmei understood this tension. She did not try to stop him, but neither did she fully embrace him. Her approach was careful, deliberate. She permitted his growing presence, but never granted him formal recognition. At court, he remained unofficial. In the provinces, he became indispensable. The connection between Gyoki and Prince Obito complicated that balance. As a mother, Genmei had long shielded her son from premature elevation. But as he aged, she faced a narrowing window. The time was coming when she would have to step down. In that interval, Gyoki's teachings began to shape the prince's worldview. He learned not only the rituals of court Buddhism, but the ethical demands of compassion and service that Gyoki promoted. To some ministers, this seemed harmless, useful even, as the boy grew into moral awareness. To others, it was a danger. A sovereign trained in Gyoki's philosophy might prioritize public works over aristocratic order. He might listen to the people before the ministers. He might see rule not as inheritance, but as burden. Genmei observed this with caution. She did not remove Gyoki, but she surrounded her son with competing voices, court scholars, Confucian instructors, bureaucrats versed in law and precedent. She ensured that while Gyoki could influence, he could not dominate. The prince was never left alone with any one system of thought. And through this quiet balancing, Genmei maintained control, not by forbidding Gyoki's influence, but by enclosing it within her own. Still, the lines between spiritual guidance and political direction began to blur. Gyoki's growing network of lay followers expanded into regions long disconnected from central authority. His projects addressed needs the court had failed to meet: roads, wells, temples, community granaries. And while none of these challenged Genmei's rule directly, they formed an alternate structure of legitimacy, one rooted in service, not lineage. Genmei, ever watchful, let it continue. Perhaps because she feared backlash, perhaps because she saw its usefulness, or perhaps because she recognized something in Gyoki that mirrored her own rule, quiet, structural, and difficult to dislodge. As Prince Obito matured, he moved through these tensions without declaring allegiance. He remained loyal to his mother, but attentive to the monk. And in that duality, Genmei saw the shape of the future forming, not one she could fully control, but one she could still prepare. The court watched both the boy and the monk, and the empress kept watching all of them. In the 8th year of her reign, Empress Genmei did what no woman on the chrysanthemum throne had done before. She named her own era. The choice was deliberate. She called it Wado, meaning harmony copper. The name marked more than the passage of time. It introduced a new substance into imperial identity: metal, mined from within Japan's own soil, refined into coin, and circulated with the authority of the state. That coin, the Wado Kaichin, became the first officially sanctioned currency in Japanese history. Its production marked a turning point in the structure of the nation's economy, but more deeply, it signaled a shift in the way imperial rule would be measured and remembered. No longer only in lineage, rituals, or edicts, but in something stamped, traded, and held in the hand. The copper used in the Wadokaichin came from a newly discovered vein in the Chichibu region, and Genmei seized on its symbolic value. Until then, Japan had relied on Chinese imports and barter systems for much of its material exchange. By authorizing a domestic coinage, she positioned her reign as both self-sufficient and modern, drawing from Tang administrative models, but asserting native strength. The coin itself bore no portrait, no masculine seal, no ancestral reference, only stylized characters and the implication of trust. Its creation required not only technical expertise, but political will. The coordination of metalworkers, transportation routes, tax structures, and minting authorities. Genmei's government delivered all of them, quietly but precisely. At the same time, she initiated the completion of the Fudoki, a collection of provincial reports that documented local geography, culture, resources, and folklore. The compilation had begun in earlier reigns, but under Genmei it gained urgency. The provinces were instructed to submit detailed records, descriptions of mountains, rivers, boundaries, customs, harvests. These documents were not simply encyclopedic. They were instruments of state intelligence. They made visible the unseen corners of the realm and brought them into the language of central governance. The Fudoki allowed Genmei's administration to understand where rice could be taxed, where land could be claimed, where shrines could be monitored, and where resistance might grow. It was knowledge as infrastructure. Both reforms, the minting of coins and the compiling of records, functioned not as dramatic gestures, but as layers in a broader architecture. They made the abstract idea of imperial rule into something real, counted, weighed, circulated, and archived. And by embedding these structures into daily life, Genmei shifted the throne's foundation from divine right toward administrative permanence. The coin did not ask who should rule. It confirmed that someone already did, and that someone, for the first time, was a woman whose name was tied not to a man's title, but to the economic breadth of a nation. The court understood the implications. With coinage came the standardization of value. With records came the standardization of land. These were tools of empire, quiet and systemic. They could not be undone by rumor, faction, or ritual. Genmei rarely spoke publicly about these initiatives. She did not need to. The coins moved on their own. The scrolls arrived on schedule. Her legacy, for those paying attention, was not in conquest or pageantry. It was in systems that made her presence unavoidable, even in silence. She ruled not only by decree, but by design. In 715, Empress Genmei did what few sovereigns ever choose to do. She stepped down from the throne, not under pressure or in disgrace, but with calculated precision. After 8 years of rule, she passed the crown not to her son, the expected heir, but to her daughter, Kensho. It was a decision that startled the court, not because abdication was unprecedented, but because of what it signaled. The transition was seamless on paper, wrapped in ritual, and sanctioned by precedent. Yet behind its formal grace lay something sharper, a deliberate disruption of expectation. For the second time in 2 generations, a woman now held the throne, and for the second time she did so while a male heir waited in the shadows. The court had anticipated that Genmei would govern as a placeholder for Prince Obito until he reached maturity. They expected a linear handoff, from widow to son, from interim to sovereign. But Genmei understood that the prince though of age in years, was still too closely tied to competing influences. His spiritual education under Gyoki, his limited exposure to the daily machinery of governance, and the lingering presence of rival advisors made his elevation fragile. By delaying his accession, Genmei bought time. But by passing the throne to Gensho instead, she did more than delay. She introduced uncertainty into the rhythm of succession. If women could rule as more than placeholders, if the throne could pass from mother to daughter, not just to son, then the structure of authority itself was altered. That change was not proclaimed. It was enacted, quietly, and with finality. Gensho had served as Genmei's aide and companion throughout her reign. She was present in court audiences, observed the operations of bureaucracy, and learned how power moved behind the scenes. Unlike her brother, she had been groomed within the palace's administrative spine. Her rise was not unearned, but it was also not expected. The court, already uneasy with Genmei's unshakable stillness, now had to confront another woman who showed no signs of yielding quickly. What had seemed an anomaly was now a sequence. And with that sequence came fear, not of the women themselves, but of the precedent. Genmei's abdication was not a retreat. It was a repositioning. She took the honorary title of Taijo Tenno, retired empress, and remained an active presence within the court. Her influence over appointments, religious affairs, and internal strategy did not vanish. If anything, it deepened, now unbound by the obligations of ceremonial visibility. In public, Konsho reigned. In practice, the mother still watched. The effect was one of layered sovereignty. There was no vacuum, no instability, only the quiet continuation of control under a different name. The political families who had hoped to direct the prince now found themselves distanced once more. The Fujiwara, in particular, had waited years for Obito's rise as an opportunity to reshape the court around their lineage. Genmei's decision shifted that horizon again. Her silence offered no comfort. She gave no reasons, issued no justifications. The act stood on its own, and in that, it became harder to challenge. She had not broken law or tradition. She had merely interpreted both with unsettling freedom. By choosing her daughter, Genmei did more than extend her dynasty. She fractured the idea that the imperial line could be shaped solely by male succession. Even if temporary, the image of two successive empresses made the court confront its own assumptions. The gesture was not one of ideology, but of structure, placing a second woman in power and daring the court to call it chance. They could not, and she knew they would not forget. When Prince Obito finally rose to the throne as Emperor Shomu in 724, he did so with a manner that confounded many of the same court officials who had once anticipated a pliable, unformed sovereign. They had expected a ruler shaped by priests, softened by delay, perhaps even made insecure by the long years spent watching others govern in his place. But what emerged was a sovereign who chose his moments carefully, built systems before declaring victories, and placed symbolism above spectacle. The decisions he made did not mimic his mother's directly, but the pattern was unmistakable. In his restraint, they heard her silence. In his reforms, they saw her imprint. Genmei had not ruled through domination, but through calibration, and Shomu had learned every angle of that method, not through instruction, but through observation. As a child, he had lived through a reign shaped not by expansion or warfare, but by institutional consolidation. He had watched his mother move the capital, establish coinage, authorize detailed provincial records, and manage the dangerous rise of provincial religious influence. Each of these actions had been delivered without personal elevation. She never made herself the center of public adoration, nor did she explain her choices beyond the formalities of court. That model, ruled by structure rather than personality, was the one Obito inherited. And when he finally held the crown, it became the one he followed. Under Shomu, the state expanded its use of Buddhist institutions, not only as centers of faith, but as extensions of governance. Monasteries were given administrative roles. Temples were constructed across provinces in patterns that mirrored bureaucratic networks. The court's relationship to religion shifted from cautious tolerance to deliberate integration. While these changes marked a new stage in the fusion of spiritual and political authority, they also reflected the foundational tensions Genmei had managed in her later reign, where the monk Kyoki had unsettled the court with his independence, and where the balance between centralized rule and provincial autonomy remained fragile. Shomu did not suppress that tension. He organized it. The results were complex, at times unstable, but always patterned with the same layered structure his mother had modeled: silence, followed by system. His economic and administrative decisions also reflected Genmei's legacy. He expanded on the Fudoki model, requiring even more detailed provincial surveys and standardizing record-keeping beyond what had been previously attempted. He oversaw continued minting of coinage and reinforced the presence of official currency across distant regions. In doing so, he furthered the project his mother had begun, making imperial authority something visible, traceable, and repeatable. Where previous emperors had relied on inherited presence, Shomu relied on infrastructure. He did not assert his rule through lineage alone, but through the machinery of governance. Even his personal demeanor bore traces of Genmei's model. He avoided theatrical power. He often delegated while maintaining ultimate control. His speeches, rare and formal, echoed the cadence of past edicts rather than seeking emotional appeal. He reigned not as a break from what came before, but as a continuation of it. The years spent watching his mother recede from the center while reinforcing the perimeter had not left him uncertain. They had given him a blueprint. By the time Genmei died in 721, 3 years before her son's accession, her physical presence had already faded from public view. But the structure she had built remained intact. Gensho still held the throne. The capital still functioned on her designs. The coin still carried her era's name, and the child who had watched all of it unfold quietly, patiently, was preparing not just to rule, but to continue, not in her shadow, but in her shape. When Empress Genmei died in 721, her name did not carry the weight of conquest, miracles, or legend. Her reign produced no wars to remember, no battles to mark territory, no rebellions that redrew the map. There were no final declarations, no sweeping reforms named after her, and no monuments erected to dramatize her rule. What she left behind was quieter and harder to erase. In the city of Heijō-kyō, whose gates still stood firm, her design remained intact. In the Wadokaichen coins, still circulating across provinces, her era name held value not as memory, but as function. In the lineage of rule that followed, Shaped by her choreography of succession, the precedent she set endured, even when it was not spoken aloud. She did not rule to be remembered. She ruled to hold the shape of the state steady, and she succeeded. The Nara period that followed would become known for its increasing formalization of imperial bureaucracy, the consolidation of religious and administrative authority, and the expansion of centralized law. Much of that was made possible by decisions Genmei had already set in motion. The capital she commissioned provided a permanent foundation from which laws could be administered consistently. Scrolls could be preserved securely, and ministries could operate in concert rather than by region. The physical layout of Heijō-kyō reflected a worldview of central order, a grid that radiated not power but control. Roads led outward, but all meaning returned to the palace. That city would outlast her, and it would shape generations of rule after her death. It became the template not just for governance, but for legitimacy. Her authorization of the Fudoki provincial records extended this logic beyond stone and timber. The scrolls demanded not only facts, but perspective. Each province was required to describe its natural resources, its borders, its myths. These weren't just ethnographic exercises, they were tools of consistency. By requiring each region to see itself through the language of the court, Genmei stitched the peripheries into the center. In doing so, she transformed a patchwork of semi-autonomous domains into something closer to a singular state. The records survived. So did their structure. In succession, she created a form of order that the court had long feared, planned, deliberate, female-led. Her decision to abdicate in favor of her daughter, Gensho, was more than a gesture. It was a second movement in a sequence that challenged the unspoken rule of male primacy. While Gensho's reign would also be framed as transitional, serving until Shomu was prepared, Genmei's legacy made it impossible to claim such transitions were accidental. She had shown that female rule did not have to be a pause. It could be policy. Even after the court returned to male emperors, the imprint remained. Future generations could not look back and say it had never been done. The precedent, once established, became part of the record. She left no edicts that would be inscribed in poetry. She offered no divine visions to be canonized. Her silence left few words behind. But her actions lingered in every mechanism of the state. Where others ruled through spectacle, Genmei ruled through process. She used seals instead of speeches, appointments instead of allegiances, architecture instead of arguments. Her influence spread not through a single reform, but through the conditions she created, conditions under which reform became inevitable. Her legacy is not a moment, it is a framework. The absence of conflict in her reign is often treated as footnote. But that absence was not accident. It was design. She governed through caution, balance, and restraint, not because she lacked power, but because she understood its fragility. In an era when rival princes still claimed blood rights, when monks still challenged imperial authority, and when the tools of governance were still being defined, she chose not to dominate, but to stabilize. And by doing so, she made domination harder for others. Her rule did not demand loyalty. It required coherence. That coherence lasted long after she stepped down. Even in death, her position within the court was never fully diminished. She remained the first empress to pass power from mother to daughter, and then indirectly to her son. That continuity became part of the imperial narrative. The structure she left behind allowed Emperor Shomu to govern with confidence and to expand the reach of the state into areas Genmei had prepared but not yet transformed. His reforms were built on her groundwork. His legitimacy was strengthened by the absence of chaos in the years before. In that way, her presence endured, not as memory, but as condition. Genmei's reign sits quietly in the historical record, not erased, but often underexplored. She did not inspire legends. She avoided spectacle. But her fingerprints are everywhere, in the names of coins, in the shape of the capital, in the structure of law, and in the uninterrupted flow of succession. She ruled in stillness, and that stillness held. What do you think? Was she a savior or a shadow?